today's topics, it's going to take 3 people to replace Bob. And so we're going to do tag team coverage of depression, anxiety disorders, and psychoses in other order. So this is picking up on where you left off at your last lecture, I believe, which is talking about mental disorders in older adults. I want to start with a little introduction, giving something of a perspective about things I wish you would keep in mind. And one thing I wish you would keep in mind is that most older adults do not have a mental illness. And in fact, my colleague Mick Smyer and I did an estimate that 22% of older adults meet criteria for any mental disorder. But this includes dementia. And in general, older adults have similar or even lower overall prevalence of mental disorders compared to younger adults. And the way you get to this answer is that older adults have less of almost every disorder, but more dementia. And this is a picture for you of the secret book that tells you the criteria for all the mental disorders. And our favorite part of the history is how the book keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And this does not mean that there's more mental disorder. That means that there are more psychiatrists. So somewhere 20 to 25 years ago, there was an effort to estimate rates of mental disorder in the population with something called the epidemiologic catchment area survey. And they used an instrument called the diagnostic interview schedule that used the DSM criteria, it was in DSM-3, to estimate rates of different mental disorders in different age groups in the population. And the results from the ECA continue to be cited. So showing you here, and this gives you an idea of exactly what I'm saying, is you're comparing 18 to 24, 25 to 44, 45 to 64, and 65 plus. And if you look at all the DIS diagnoses, so these are mental disorders not including dementia, you get this lower rates in people 65 and older. And a subset of these are affective or mood disorders, including major depressive disorder, and you get that same pattern. Whereas with cognitive impairment, you get the rise with age. So if you take this red bar and you lift it up and you set it on here, you would get the result that there's no significant age differences in total rate of disorders. Now the ECA data, again, were collected 20 to 25 years ago, and what has happened since then is most efforts to look at rates of mental disorders in older adults have largely replicated the findings of the ECA. The most recent replication is something called the National Comorbidity Survey. And the original National Comorbidity Survey that was done by Ron Kessler stopped at age 55 plus, but more recently he did a replication of the National Comorbidity Survey, and it included older adults. And it, instead of using the DIS, the Diagnostic Interview Schedule, it uses something called the CD, Composite International Diagnostic Interview, and it maps onto DSM-4 criteria for disorders. And here I'm going to show you rates of just these categories of disorders, broken out by age. So this is from the National Comorbidity Survey replication. And Amber Gum has just now, in fact, published these age differences. So this is any disorder, and these are the particular disorders broken out. I could not find a way to separate this into the youngest age into 2 age groups. So you don't have a younger age and then an increase and then a decline like you had before. They're clumped. But you can see exactly that same pattern that we saw with the epidemiologic catchment area survey. Now, a few more things that I would like you to keep in mind is in older adults, and this is also true in adolescents and quite young adults, is that although rates of mental disorder that meet diagnostic criteria are lower, there's a high rate of symptoms that are insufficiently severe to meet the criteria for the mental disorder. And what is also important is that these symptoms are significant. They are related to bad outcomes in one's life. So having a lot of depressive symptoms, but not meeting criteria for depressive disorder, still is not a great place to be. Another comment that I want to make, again by way of sort of building a context as we talk about each of the disorders in more detail, is that people talk about an increase in mental disorders. But if you compare the epidemiologic catchment area survey with the National Comorbidity Survey, so we're looking 20 years different, the rates of disorders are not different. The percentage of percentage of a population age 65 to 74, the percentage age 75 plus who meet criteria for a mental disorder is not changing. However, there are more older adults with mental disorders because there are more older adults. So this leads people to write papers about the crisis about mental disorders in older adults, and particularly the crisis in having enough personnel to meet those needs. And so, importantly, it's not because somehow more older people are getting mental disorders, but rather just that we are getting more older people. Another point of background, and I think this is really important, is to distinguish between mental disorders who have their first onset in old age compared to older adults who arrive at old age bringing a mental disorder with them that's been part of their life earlier. The people whose first onset is in old age are sometimes referred to in the term true geriatric disorder. Robert Kahn used that expression. And it is the case with most mental disorders, dementia being the exception, that somewhere in the range of half of the onsets are in earlier life and half later. We'll actually hear one other exception as our multi-actor lecture continues. And there is also probably a final category of mental disorders where a person has had long-standing personal characteristics that may be not the most functional, but the person doesn't really get in trouble with the mental health system until old age, when there's other challenges in the person's life that makes how he or she was handling going through life suddenly not work so well. And we certainly see examples of this in our clinic, where in particular we will have people show up at the clinic where the person may have had just a mild case of a personality disorder her whole life. And as you become older and older, it's harder to get by with being cute. And so this woman ends up in our clinic complaining about being depressed. So that's a less clean-cut case. But for the most part, you can divide into cases with a previous history and then cases where the first onset is in old age. And then we will